I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you both, Nomzamo Zondo from SERI, the Executive Director of SERI, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute, and Vuyo Mntonintshi from CELS, the Center for Applied Legal Studies. So today we are having a conversation around the national state of disaster. Sis Nomzamo, I'll start with you. What is it? What is the national state of disaster, and what is the law that gives effect to it, and what are the powers of the state around, this national state of disaster?
Yeah, so I prepared the definition according to the Act because it's a mouthful, right? It's not as easy to just say this is what it is. And so the Act provides that a disaster is a progressive or sudden, widespread or localized natural or human cause occurrence or an event, right? Which causes or threatens to cause death, injury, or disease. And as that's just like the first part, right? There's still an issue about damage to property and where there's disruption of life of a community. But the part that's key is how this must be of a magnitude that exceeds the ability of those affected to deal with it themselves. So in this case, if we look at COVID-19, there is the challenge of, yes, you have the people who are affected, but there's a challenge to the whole country because of how quickly the disease can spread. And so the nationally, so the disaster management actually allows 3 levels of a state of disaster. So it allows for a national state of disaster, a provincial state of disaster, and a local state of disaster. So in this case, the Minister of Cooperative Governance has declared a national state of disaster under Section 27 of the Disaster Management Act. And she is empowered under Section 27 to restrict movement, to restrict transport, to restrict the sale of goods and services. She's in that section, she's allowed to take steps to try and address the disaster or limit its destructive effect. And so what we have here, and as we've seen through the regulations that were first declared, I think on the 17th of March, we've seen the Minister of COCTA try and take those steps. I think the biggest concern for almost all of us has been, I think, initially when we received the first regulations, there was a limit on gathering. There was there was a limit on of course how there was already at that time how the state would address with people who are impacted or affected. But then the later regulations of the 25th of February are the ones that really brought the issue home for most of us, as we're now confined to our home, except in certain circumstances.
To just add on what Mrs. Nomzamo has alluded to in defining the national state of disaster, what are the rights, that cannot be disproportionately eroded in this current state? We have seen a number of incidents where the state has acted beyond the law. So what are some of the rights, or can certain rights be violated by the state in this current state?
I think that Socio has already alluded what actually the state of disaster actually means. So people tend to make a little bit of a mistake between the national disaster and when a state of emergency has been declared. So in a state of a national disaster, as Nomzamo has alluded, actually does not suspend the rights of any other rights that are there in the Constitution. But of course, in terms of what the regulations say, so the president or the minister of COPTA has powers to restrict some of the rights to ensure that actually, we are able to deal with the pandemic, like the restriction of movement and so forth and so forth. But I mean, what we have seen as well is that what the Act also says is someone contravenes them, someone then has to be charged, criminal for contravening the regulations. But what we have seen, particularly, especially in the working class areas, townships, and sometimes in villages, is that actually the police and also the military, instead sometimes of arresting, sometimes use force, power, and sometimes I've seen even frog jumps on TV and all those kind of things, push-ups, people subjected to all sorts of punishments. I think that's what actually we have seen. I think as Nomzamo alluded, so when a restriction of movement, we have been subjected to be in our homes unless it's an essential service. So that also requires one to have a permit if it's work, but then if it's not work, just to buy food and so forth, therefore you can. But there is an indication that sometimes if you are in the township or sometimes if you are in the inner city in Johannesburg, even before you can be able to produce, even to explain yourself why are you outside, you have already been met, with force. We've seen also in Alexandra some people, going to buy groceries and also having groceries, but still being, being asked for permits, being punished. Some of them have even been arrested. So I think that's the whole concept. So that, in essence, so because of this national state of disaster, it really doesn't suspend, people's rights.
And perhaps, Nomzamo, you can, touch on this issue. We have seen that the state, the national government, says there is a state of, or national state of disaster. And then there are certain moratoriums that were put in place, for instance, on evictions. But for some reason, there is no uniformity in how this is applied in terms of provinces and municipalities. What might be the problem around that issue, where there is no uniformity in terms of application of the regulations?
At the end of March, we had the Minister of Justice in the directive that issued under the regulations. He placed a moratorium on evictions, but immediately after that, we witnessed evictions in the eThekwini metropolitan. In the eThekwini metro, we also saw evictions in Johannesburg and in the city of Cape Town. And in all those instances, the state was claiming that they were demolishing unoccupied, incomplete structures. And in all those communities, the communities came forward and said, but clearly we have video footage, we have photographs that show that we are already in occupation. But for some strange reason, the state has insisted that it's not an eviction, because we haven't moved anyone who's already in occupation, but we are only trying to repel an ongoing land invasion. And all these cases have been determined on what has come up is a dispute of fact about whether or not there was occupation. But it's important to highlight that this happens at a time when legal practitioners are not allowed to go out and seek proper instructions. They're not allowed to go out and collect evidence on behalf of their clients. They're actually only allowed to leave their homes when they're going to attend to a court hearing. So it's made things very difficult for people who have been evicted to seek legal representation, because they seek it in an environment where they can't, as they would normally, go into an attorney's office, have the attorney come and see the problem with them. And it was quite useful that last week we saw the National Command Council and we saw in the regulations that there's a specific moratorium on evictions, which makes it clear that at least at a national level, national government is quite clear that we don't care what kind of structure it is. We don't want you doing anything with it. We want you to make sure that everyone has a home and to protect the whole country against COVID-19, not just that particular household. Unfortunately, it seems that all these municipalities, because now you're talking about the three big metros, eThekwini, Cape Town, and Johannesburg, have decided to persist and have decided to ignore the call that's been made by national government to ensure that there are no more evictions. It was quite interesting, I think, when we were litigating the case in eThekwini, is that they claimed that even though you saw us removing a bed out of the structure, it was not a home. While in the media and in the public, they kept insisting that no, it's incomplete, unoccupied.
And perhaps we are to add on what Mrs. Nomzamo is alluding to, the spheres of government, these three-tier spheres of government. Is there a contradiction? Is there a problem here? Because if national government is saying there shouldn't be evictions, but today there are evictions in eThekwini, in Cape Town, and in Johannesburg. What does that mean really in terms of spheres of government?
Look, I mean, the question of the pronouncement and the moratorium on evictions does not only apply to state lands or only to states, to the state. It also applies, I mean, the regulation is very clear that even if it's a formal or even an informal dwelling, then that person should definitely not be, I mean, to be evicted. So the regulations, I mean, as they're structured, that places moratorium on evictions don't only apply only to, I mean, to the state. Basically, it also apply even to us as private citizens and even owners of property. So even I myself, if I want to evict someone, I mean, effectively it means I can't. It's not necessarily something that only should be the state. So the question then we are asking is whether it is a disjuncture or social distancing, if I can put it that way, between the state and also the local municipalities. One perhaps could implore to say maybe it seems as if there is, but I mean, the local government seem to run on a narrative like Sis Nomzamo has explained, that actually what we've been doing here consistently since the pronouncement is that we are not evicting anyone, but we are stopping everyone from coming in. So that's what the kind of a narrative actually that they are using, so that it doesn't seem as if they are going contrary to what the regulations and also what the state at the national and provincial level is actually pronounced. So that's where actually the technicality that they have tried to apply to ensure that they continue evicting, I mean, everyone that Nomzamo actually is referred to. And also what we've seen that has been happening now in Johannesburg South, and also I think it was in Cape Town with the LRC, I think sometime, I think on Friday, that's when the judgment actually came out. So that's what actually really that you have to see. And also you have to also have something what was very interesting for me is that in Cape Town, for instance, so in as much as there was a moratorium that was pronounced, so the city of Cape Town carried on with these evictions and demolitions. So upon when the court order was granted in favor of the occupiers, and then the Minister of Human Settlements and Water and Sanitation, Ms. Lindiwe Sisulu, actually comes in and also to say, no, what the city has been doing has been wrong, and then gave them tents in the meantime whilst they're still waiting for structures to be erected. I mean, my experience mostly around the questions of evictions, I'm not sure about this Nomzamo, is that, I mean, they also a political play that, I mean, that usually happens, I mean, which, who runs the local municipality, who runs the provincial government, and also who runs the national government. So it's always an issue that comes into play. That's why if anything happens now in the city of Johannesburg, because even provincially it's held by the same person. So, I mean, obviously they take the same stance, but then if it's in Cape Town or in any other municipality not ran by, you know, the ruling party or any other opposition party, then you see something different in terms of how the higher structures actually intervene.
So the fact that we are not able to convince municipalities to comply with the moratorium, it makes things very difficult in dealing with private landlords. I think in the last few weeks, the appeals hotline has been receiving a lot of complaints from tenants who are having challenges with their landlords, who at this point are not evicting them, are either demanding that they vacate, or they are disconnecting their power or disconnecting their water, which is something that they shouldn't be doing. So it makes it very difficult. I think if national government cannot make municipalities toe the line, it's going to be very difficult to convince private parties to do so. If we all agree that this is a national disaster, that we all need to bring our resources to try and fight against, that means that everybody must be willing to comply and toe the line. So I think it's at this point, I mean, we haven't seen, while there's been the beginnings of these threats from private landlords, I think we're going to need the leadership of national government and local government to say to private property owners, you cannot evict, you cannot disconnect services. And it's going to be very difficult to say that with a straight face if they're themselves evicting people.
and perhaps on the issue of access to justice around this time. What then do people do? Because it seems, COVID-19 has really affected the very core of humanity, where people cannot mobilize. If they do so, they're already in breach of regulations. So what is the alternative or option for people really to challenge, injustices when they happen?
I mean, it's a very difficult question, really. I mean, I guess to place this upon ourselves in terms of what really is an alternative. Because, like Nomzamo explained, because legal service is not declared as essential service, meaning that really there's not much that we can be able to do in our heads. I mean, of course, you're correct. It does affect the question of access to justice for those whom their rights are currently being violated as it is. Because even them themselves also are finding it slightly a little bit difficult. I mean, just to move around, they can't come to ferry, can't come to care or come anywhere. I mean, they rely really just on trying to make telephone conversations, and then that's the only way where we can really be able to do something. But I guess what has been placed by government is that the alternative that government has put in place has simply said, if your rights have been violated in a different way, then they give all these other independent ombudsman to say if one is being violated, let's say by the police brutality, therefore you report IPID. If it's a military person, and then you must report it the military ombudsman. And then if maybe something else, I mean, the police stations are still open, you can still go for a protection order if someone who has been violated by someone that they're in a domestic relationship with. So that's basically what they do have. But if there's anything that really does happen, I guess the only way, it's what Nomzamo had said, for them to access justice as it is to call the hotlines, to call legal aid if they are also open. I think that's the only way. Just to work remotely. I mean, there's really no any other way that, I mean, there's no any other alternative, really.
And Nomzamo, do you want to add?
Yes, so I think the one thing that's been very important is that civil society and many of movements that are active in the country have joined together to form the C19 People's Coalition. And I think that's been the one space where there has been mobilization around some of the issues that the challenges that people are currently facing. And I just wanted to also just point out that the very same coalition has put together a document which explains the state of disaster and what are people's rights at the moment. So if people can look at there is a Facebook page, and I also believe there's a Twitter account and there's a website for the C19 People's Coalition. But I also think, I mean, it is very difficult to mobilize, virtually through telephone, through social media. But I think there has been attempts by civil society to continue to have a voice despite these restrictions. And I think even as we speak now, there's currently a People's Assembly of the COVID-19 People's Coalition.
And just to ask a further question, Mrs. Nomzamo. So we know that the lockdown came at a time where South Africa was battling with some of the issues like femicide. In this current climate and in this current context, do people, I mean, especially the right to access to justice, how do we try and mobilize around those issues so that they are dealt with? Because people are at home, some of them with their abusers. I mean, how do we, deal with those issues in the context of regulations?
Yo, that's a very, very difficult question. I don't know if Vuyo has a response, but I think the one thing that I can say is one, as I think as the public interest legal services sector, we have tried to make resources available so people are able to access legal support. We've also, I think, during this time tried to push the state to make sure that there are resources for people to be accommodated elsewhere. I think, quite honestly, if we're struggling before there was national shutdown, the situation is much worse now. I think that I have to admit that, and it makes things very, very difficult to then say, what do I do if I'm locked in with my abuser? Where do I go? How do I get assistance? I mean, when we were running the Abahlali case, there were even just at police stations, people are being sent back and can't open criminal cases. So while if you manage to leave your home, you then, to get to the police station, you can get there and then you can be turned back on the basis of why you're here. So the situation is very, very difficult. And I think maybe I don't, I'll wait for Vuyo before I move on to this point. I think the biggest issue, again, during this lockdown has been the fact that people will not have an income because of the lockdown, and the state's failure to completely address the need, one, to force employers to ensure that people have an income, or two, provide a social security that will be enough to make sure that people can actually live during this time.
And Vuyo, before you respond, I know that Kells, was doing a case around shelters for abused women, and just before the lockdown was announced, there were some that were being evicted. I mean, around such issues, how do you deal with them, and the inhumanity of people who are actually evicting people around this time? How do you deal with that legally?
So, let me just first add to what Nomzamo has said. So the difficulty with femicide and domestic violence is that it happens in a confined space, in our homes, and really there's no one there to see what really is happening, because it's happening next door, or it's just happening in your home, and we don't have access to your home. And even if someone would say then, like we have seen what the Minister of Police said, just after 10 days post the lockdown, he received something almost 80,000 phone calls from people reporting domestic violence. And what also usually happens in these kinds of cases is that even if I do report that someone is actually abusing me during lockdown, what really happens when that person, let's say, gets bail or the person is not arrested, still comes back, to the very same home that we are in. So most people actually don't necessarily report such crimes, but if abuse does still happen, people can still be able, to approach the domestic violence court, because they've said they are not going to close. And really, that kind of a system, it's not a very cumbersome system. So how the domestic violence courts are structured is that they're structured in such a way that even if someone is unrepresented, they are able to bring the case, because everything is manual, and most people usually appear unrepresented by any attorneys. And then if you are applying for something like a protection order, for instance. So those kind of courts are still open. So to come back and deal with the question of shelters. So shelters as well, in terms of what the Minister of Social Development has said in her own regulations, that such shelters are also not closed. So if someone has been abused at home and reports to the police then can still make that same recommendation, or the prosecutor can still make the same recommendation, that because this person is in imminent danger, is also a survivor of violence. So therefore, that person should also be admitted in a shelter for women and also for children who are abused. Even during this particular point in time, you can. So I remember just when just after the 15th of March, when the president declared, globally it was declared that this is a pandemic, and also our president followed suit. I remember we had about 2 urgent applications that we had to deal with, where someone was, a lady was also evicted from this kind of domestic violence shelters. So what really you try to do is not really different from what you do in a normal, pie eviction sort of cases. To say that this person, if evicted, the person will be rendered homeless. And also if the person on admission makes an admission that actually this domestic violence shelter, it's a home, because now there's nowhere else where she can be able to go, then we always bring in more or less the same application, or they call it in law a spoliation application, so that the person can be returned back there if there's no court order. So what was happening in these cases that we were dealing with, so there was no court order. Actually, so the problem was the curfew. So if one arrives after a certain time and then therefore you are locked out, then you can't come in. So when one of our clients, she was given a pass out to go to hospital, but I think there was a miscommunication, the latest one, between the officials of the shelter. And then we had to bring in a very urgent spoliation to get her in. So even in these kind of instances, that's really what you then just have to do. But of course, you have to place, the woman's experience also in application. If someone is outside woman, they'll be rendered very vulnerable. And it's even more worse now during COVID. If someone is just outside on the street, they can easily, contract the virus. So it goes against the purpose of what actually the disaster was declared for, to try and curb.
Perhaps in closing remarks, and this question is for both of you, Ms. Nomzamo, the constitutionality of the regulations and also the conduct, of the law enforcement has been questionable. And will we see perhaps challenges constitutionally of these regulations and also the conduct of the law enforcement? Because it seems that the purpose of the regulation, which is to help people self-distance and isolate and self-isolate, is not being really, done by the brutality, the humiliation that is happening. Will we see like the constitutional challenge on these regulations?
So, we've already, I think, in the very first week of the regulations, there was a constitutional challenge to the regulations. Unfortunately, it was dismissed by the Constitutional Court without a hearing. I think the main challenge has been the fact that everybody takes the threat that we are currently facing very, very seriously. And there has to be questions about how proportional the state's response has been to the challenge. And I think when we look at what's happening everywhere else in the world, we almost understand why there would be even an over-response, right? And some people might say it's better to over-respond than to under-respond. But I think I think there's two things that are separate, right? There's the issue about whether or not the regulations themselves are constitutional. I think for most part, right, the regulations have tried to be proportional, but you see that there's been some restrictions on movement that go a bit further than they should under the regulations. But then the biggest issue has been the enforcement of the lockdown through the use of the police and the army, and specifically their brutality. And I think there it's the implementation of the instruction rather than the instruction themselves that are a problem. And I think the main challenge has been the fact that government and nationally, both the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Police, and the President have failed to speak decisively against the police brutality. So you always hear a sort of a slip of tongue where there's, on the one hand, an apologeticness from these ministries, and then there's always this wagging of a finger to say, but if you keep behaving this way, what do you expect the army and the police to do? And it was quite, for me, I remember when the directives from the Ministry of Justice came out, I was quite impressed by the fact that on those directives, if you got arrested for non-compliance, you're supposed to be released automatically. They encourage police bail. They try to make it easier for you to be released. But I'm sure within a day or two, people with police cells were full with people who were not released automatically. We are seeing an abuse of police power with people who are actually complying with the lockdown. People who are going to buy groceries because they need them, and are then being abused by the police. And I think it's been a failure to address that decisively that's really brought into question whether or not we need all these measures.
I think I agree with Nomzamo, but let me just make one point. I think for me, the experience that I've seen, throughout the pronouncement of the lockdown, the development of the regulations, that really there was a serious social distancing on the part of the state and the people. If you see the structure in terms of how the first regulations were actually structured, you could see that really they were structured for a particular class of people in society, which made it a little bit very difficult, for most people who are in informal settlements, townships and so forth, for them really to move. I mean, if you can imagine being told that you will be, you are literally going to be told that you must just remain at home or where you consider to be your home, and it's just in an informal settlement, and there are so many of you in the house and you can't go outside. It really could be a little bit difficult for me even to comprehend. So I guess the whole thing of encouraging everyone to social distance perhaps could have been easier for some of us, but not for everyone. It's actually very easy for them. It's very difficult. And also the question that most people actually in South Africa and the country, I mean, they belong in informal, precarious sort of work. Some couldn't work, some couldn't do anything. So the whole question of food, hunger, and poverty also came into play. So South Africa is such a very unique country as compared to other countries that have declared lockdowns and also some state of emergencies. So I mean, that's the context that we really have to understand actually how everything else actually comes from. So I mean, in terms of how the police enforcement, brutality, and all those kind, I think really they stem from there. They seem to me, unless I've not been noticing properly, that they seem to be more harsher when they deal with people who are in the township and also people who are in informal settlements. Like Nomzamo explains, if someone really, honestly, is working just to go and buy food somewhere not so far, and then they are met with so much of force and all those kind of things. And I mean, we have seen it as well, we have seen it as well in their own police ministers, concession, that don't let anyone delela you. I think that's the kind of a language that if someone doesn't want to comply, force them to. So I think that's really where everything else comes from. But we must also understand as well, the history. In terms, when we deal with people like the military are not effectively really trained to deal with civilians. Everywhere where they come in, they are so violent because that's how they are usually trained. So that's what perhaps we have seen, maybe where there could have been a beef up more of, the police instead of using the soldiers, but that's something very different. That's the one point to say, are we going to see more challenges? I don't know how many cases I've been trying to keep up with how many cases have been brought to challenge the regulations. There's been many, but I think also I think they're also important for these cases to keep on coming so that we are able, as we go along, to try and amend and see how we can work around the regulations working for each and everyone. Because clearly, if someone is challenging them on the basis that they can't buy clothes for their children who were born just before, then that kind of a space must be made for those so that they are able to do so. So I don't think we are going to see the end of challenges to the regulations until I'm sure that the lockdown is uplifted. We're still going to see more challenges. Like I've said, even last week there was also a challenge from Lawyers Association as well in Cape Town, challenging the very same regulations to declare legal services, essential service, so that we are able to assist, the most vulnerable people, in our communities. So I think we're still going to see more challenges, and we're still going to see more amendments to the regulations as time goes, until such a time when, the lockdown or Corona will ever end. If Corona if we find a solution to it.
Sure. Yeah. No, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you both. You've been amazing, to clarify the position legally and the rights that, people have. On behalf of the Forge, I would like to thank you guys and also congratulate Ser for reaching a milestone of a decade. Thank you so much.
We appreciate that. Thank you so much, Musa.